Welcome to the part 4 of season 1 in the Keio International Christian University Linguistic Colloquium. I'm Seunghun from International Christian University. And today we have two exciting talks by Jiseung Kim from University of Michigan and Sang-im Lee Kim from National Chiao University in Taiwan. Now Shigeto will introduce Jiseung.
All right. Hello. So I'm Shigeto Kawahara from Keio University, one of the co-organizers. It's my pleasure to introduce Jiseung Kim, who has graduated from the University of Michigan this just past spring, and she was going to start a postdoc position at University of Alberta, but with, you know what, she's stuck in Korea. So she's speaking to us from the same time zone. She has an impressive record of publications, including one paper in Journal of Phonetics and another one in JASA EL. She's going to tell us about her research that's related to her dissertation, which addresses the issue of individual differences in production and perception of prosodic boundaries in American English. And I'm particularly looking forward to this talk, as addressing individual differences is an extremely understudied but also important topic research in linguistics. So without further ado, let's hear from Jiseung.
Let me share. Should I share my slides now?
Yes, please.
I will start now. First of all, thanks to Professor Seunghun and Shigeto Kawahara for the invitation and the introduction. It is my pleasure to be presenting my research at this colloquium today, and my talk is titled Individual Differences in the Production and Perception of Prosodic Boundaries in American English. I'll start with one definition of prosody and then narrow down to the aspect of prosody I'm looking at in my study. I'll explain the theoretical backdrops in which my study is situated, and then present the goal of the study. I conducted two experiments. I'll talk about the production experiment first and then the perception experiment. The main question about the production-perception link sort of links these experiments. Lastly, I will present a combined discussion. One definition of prosody is the linguistic structure above the word level that signals prominence and phrasing by varying phonetic properties of the utterance. Here's an example of prominence marking, specifically the contrastive focus or corrective focus. And here's an example of boundary marking or phrasing. Notice the pound sign that represents the prosodic boundary. Here in the sentence pair, it's a word boundary. I am not sure if you can see my cursor. Well, in this pair, it's an intonational phrase boundary, which I will call IP boundaries throughout the talk. In this study, I'm interested in the boundary marking aspect of prosody, and I examine the phonetic properties associated with distinguishing word boundaries from IP boundaries. Here are three main components of the theoretical background that provide the context in which the study is situated: individual differences, production perception relation, and boundary marking or phrasing. This is a prosodic hierarchy of English representing the phrase structure of English. There are some disagreements about the structure, especially in the middle part, but it's generally agreed that there are higher level or phrase level prosodic boundary, which is in contrast with the word level prosodic boundary in terms of several acoustic aspects. Among them are three primary acoustic properties found in previous studies that are known to be associated with the IP boundaries: pause, phrase final lengthening, and pitch reset. I'm going to talk about the individual strategies for weighting these properties / cues in production and perception, and whether they may be related within individuals. Individual differences gained interest in recent decades, but not a lot of attention has been given to examining how individuals vary in the production of the acoustic properties of project boundaries. And the findings of the existing studies are mixed. There are even fewer studies that looked at individual variations in the perception of those IP marking properties. So it is not surprising there's little research on the production-perception relation of prosody. And one of the theoretical implications of the production-perception link concerns the initiation of sound change. That is, the mechanism of sound change based on misperception relies on the assumption that listeners' perceptual strategies reflect their own production strategies. The study has two main goals. First is to systematically examine how individuals produce and perceive these acoustic information for IP boundaries, and to test whether individuals' weighting of these information for IP boundaries is reflected in their perception. The production study involved a speech production experiment, which was first conducted with 32 speakers from Michigan. The perception experiment collected eye movement data from 19 participants who returned after participating in the production study. I'll talk about the production study first. Two hypotheses here. The three acoustic properties will be systematically modulated to distinguish IP from word boundaries across speakers. And then there will be significant differences between individual speakers in modulating these properties. I had 8 uniquely different target word sequences, which were repeated 9 times by 32 speakers. I'll use the first one here, Mamima, the second one here, Mamima Belinda, as an example from now on. Here's an example of a target word sequence within carrier sentences. These are actually very short dialogues, and the response is always the test sentence pair, which contains the target word sequence that consisted of 2 words with the target boundary in the middle. In this example, it's Mamima Belinda. And the dialogue above is the IP boundary condition where the queen is just calling Mamima, and the one below is the word boundary condition where the queen is mistakenly calling Mamima using Belinda's name. So the meaning changes when you switch the type of boundaries between the target words. The words in boldface are where the contrastive focus is located, so the target words are not page accented. I measured the durations of 4 syllables around the target boundary, 3 pre-boundary syllables, and 1 post-boundary syllable. I also measured the pause duration and pitch reset, which was the subtraction of the F0 maximum in the pre-boundary syllable from the F0 maximum in the post-boundary syllable. So a positive value would indicate the presence of a reset, which you would expect to see across an IP boundary rather than a word boundary. 2 hypotheses here. The 3 acoustic properties will be, I think I presented the hypothesis, so I will move on to the statistical analysis. I use the linear mixed effects models to test the boundary effects across speakers, and multiple regression models to test the boundary effects separately for each participant. For the results, these bar plots, the one on the left, it represents the average durations of 4 syllables measured in the IP boundary condition. They're produced by 32 participants, 1 line for each participant, and the 0 represents the target boundary. The shaded bars are lengthened syllables in the IP condition, while the dashed bars are shortened syllables in the IP condition. The 32 individuals are divided into 6 groups, depending on their final lengthening patterns. And the most common pattern was to lengthen the last 2 syllables, and the second most common pattern was lengthening just the final syllable, which shows a later onset of lengthening compared to the previous pattern. So you can see how both onset and scope of phrase final lengthening differed in these two patterns. And the three most common patterns were modeled after in the manipulation for the auditory simile used in the perception experiments. More on that, I'll explain more about that in a couple of slides. What's important here in this plot is that there were 6 different ways in which individuals manifested final lengthening in terms of syllable durations. And there's even more variation within each of these 6 groups here in terms of pause duration. In these bar plots on the right, you can see the variations in the amount of pitch reset. The lighter shaded bars are the average F0 difference across IP boundary, where you would expect to see pitch reset, therefore a lot of positive values, whereas the darker shaded bars are mostly short or negative, meaning very small or no reset across word boundary. 2 things to note in these bar plots. One is that not everyone used pitch reset to distinguish IP versus word boundary. The shaded ones indicate the individuals who did not use pitch reset. The other is the amount of reset also varied among those who did use pitch reset. Overall, there is no clear relationship between how speakers use these properties to differentiate IP and word boundaries. For instance, we don't see participants with the earlier onset of final lengthening generally having longer pause durations or greater pitch reset, or the other way around. To summarize the results, both hypotheses were supported. The 3 acoustic properties were systematically used to distinguish IP from word boundaries across speakers. And there were substantial individual variation across 32 participants in the combination of the properties used and the degree to which they were used. One of the main findings is that individual speakers varied in the duration of the pause F0 difference across IP boundary and the onset and scope of phrase final lengthening. The variable onset and scope of phrase final lengthening can be explained under the pie gesture model as that individual speakers manifest variable scope and onset of the pie gesture itself, or it is the strength of the coupling between the mute gesture, the lexical stress of the target word, and the pie gesture that vary between individuals. And the shortening effect observed in the study can also be explained in this framework. Another finding is that pitch reset was the only IP marking property that was not used to distinguish the boundaries across the board, which is in line with previous studies. Now that we have seen individual variations in how people produce IP boundaries, the question is whether the speaker-specific patterns of employing the boundary marking properties are reflected in their perception. For the perception study, I conducted an eye tracking experiment using manipulated auditory stimuli. The manipulations were based on a model speaker's production of the same sentences, and they reflected the most dominant patterns observed in the production study, as well as the model speaker's natural productions. The 3 IP boundary properties were systematically controlled, and the point of the manipulations is that the participants are exposed to different combinations of those cues, so we can try to see what they're perceiving when they hear one of the cues without the others, or 2 of them and not the other, etc. First of all, in the no pause conditions, a 240 millisecond silent interval was inserted after the second target word. So there's no pause between Mamima and Belinda. In the pause condition, the pause was inserted between the 2 target words. As for final lengthening, I mentioned that we used the 3 most common patterns of lengthening in the production study. And as the names suggest, we characterized the primary difference between these patterns as the variable onset of lengthening. So the first pattern has an early onset, the second pattern has a later onset, and the third pattern has a shortening in the first syllable on top of a later onset of lengthening. You can see how the lengthening cue becomes available to the listeners at different time points during the auditory stimuli. In addition to these 3 lengthening patterns, we had a control condition in which the syllable durations reflect the model speaker's productions in the word boundary condition. So we don't expect there to be final lengthening. And these patterns are paired with no pause and pause conditions. So we have 7 manipulation conditions so far. For each of these 7 manipulation conditions, we also varied pitch resets. No reset conditions mean that there's no pitch reset across the boundary, but rather a gradual decrease. Reset conditions mean that there's pitch resets, about 2 semitone difference across the boundary. We added a large pitch reset condition to see if the effective pitch reset would be cumulative. So we gave about 3 semitone difference across the boundary in this condition. Here are the 12 different combinations of pause, syllable durations of the pre-boundary target word, and pitch resets. In the experiment, participants were asked to decide while they're listening to the auditory stimuli which boundary they're hearing, IP or word, which were represented as 2 images on a computer monitor in front of a participant, so they can look at either image as they decide. I will play you a video of one trial in which the 3-person image representing the word boundary will appear on the left side, and the 2-person image representing the IP boundary will be on the right. And the manipulated sentence has final lengthening in the pre-boundary word mamima, but no pitch reset and no pause going into the second word belinda. So the listener looked at the word image, deciding that this is the word boundary image. The pink dot is the participant's visual fixations.
Look at the pictures. Look at the center.
The queen called Mamima Belinda, and Daisy thought that was rude.
Right.
Look at the pictures.
Moving on, participants' eye movements during each trial were recorded, and the proportion of fixations to each image on the screen was calculated for each sequence of 20 millisecond time beats. These proportion fixations were the response variables for the generalized additive mix model. The general hypothesis is that listeners are sensitive to the different IP marking properties, and that will manifest in the amount of fixations. So if they're sensitive to these properties, we will see more fixations on the IP boundary image, whereas fewer fixations on the word boundary image. And I'll talk about the results of the group level analysis first. The group level analysis concerns how the participants' responses differed depending on the manipulation conditions or the different combinations of the IP marking properties. In these line plots, the y-axis is the proportion fixations. The x-axis is time, and time 0 is aligned with the onset of the first target word in the auditory stimuli, like mamima. On the left panel, you're looking at the target fixations when there's no pause between the target words in the auditory stimuli, and the gray lines represent the fixations on the center image, and they decrease after the offset of the first target word, represented by the vertical lines. At the same time, the fixation of the word boundary in blue, they increase, while the fixation of the IP boundary, they remain flat. They are in orange. On the right, there's a pause between the target words and the stimuli, and proportion fixations on the IP boundary image increase, while the fixations on the word boundary remain flat. Sorry. I'll discuss the difference between the same colored lines in the following slides. But for now, in these line plots, they represent that the presence and absence of pause resulted in a robust difference between participants' perceptual responses. For pitch resets, there are 3 different manipulations: no, small, and large reset. When pitch reset is the only IP marker in the auditory stimuli, listeners are predicted to fixate later and less on the word boundary when they perceive a small reset compared to no reset. Even later and less when they perceive the larger reset. The same prediction holds when final lengthening is present. Without pause, listeners look at the word boundary image, like you saw in the previous slide, but they will fixate later and less on it when they perceive small resets compared to no resets. But I didn't find the pattern which pitch reset was the only, when the pitch reset was the only IP marker. So the blue line for no reset condition increases later than the other lines, which is not consistent with the prediction. There's significant difference between no versus small reset and no versus large reset in the relevant time ranges. Moving on to final lengthening, without pause and pitch reset, listeners look at the word boundary image, and there would be reduction in fixations in the lengthening conditions compared to the no lengthening condition, because the presence of lengthening conflict with the absence of pause and pitch reset. There are two different possibilities for shortening. If listeners are sensitive to lengthening but not to shortening, the shortening in the first syllable in this condition will not influence fixations after the first syllable. The difference in fixations will come later when the listeners hear lengthening. So compared to the fixations for the no lengthening condition, we will see later reduction in fixations when the listeners hear lengthening. The other possibility is that listeners are sensitive to lengthening as well as shortening. Unlike the first set of predictions, we will see earlier reduction in fixations in the last condition, because shortening in the first syllable is cueing IP boundary, unlike the previous prediction. Here are the results. Compared to the control condition with no lengthening, we see fewer fixations for the other lengthening conditions. These three panels show that the reduction is significant, meaning that listeners were sensitive to the presence of final lengthening. And these bottom three panels show that the differences after the first syllable offsets are not significant in two of these comparisons. And the significant difference here in the middle is inconsistent with the prediction, meaning that there's no evidence for shortening perceived as a cue for IP boundary in this condition. So overall, in the group level analysis, we see that the listeners were sensitive to the different combinations of the IP markers available in the stimuli, and that pause induced much more robust effect on the perceptual responses than pitch reset or final lengthening. Another main research question is whether and how the participants' production of IP boundaries predicted the timing of the same individual's perception of the boundary in the auditory stimuli. Starting with pause duration, we predict that individuals who produce longer pauses on average are more likely to be sensitive to pauses as an IP boundary marker. So they would respond earlier than those who produce shorter pauses. These are three-dimensional plots. So where the x-axis is time and the colors represent proportion of fixations, and blue means less fixations and yellow means more fixations. So you're seeing blue at the beginning and more yellow towards the end. Here, all three IP marking properties were present in the stimuli, so the listeners fixated on the IP boundary. But the timing of the fixation increases dependent on the average duration of the pauses, which is represented in the y-axis. There are 19 points, the ticks along the y-axis, and each point represents the average pause duration of one individual participant, ordered from the longest to the shortest. Notice that the colors are skewed towards left in all three conditions, although the pattern is less clear in the middle panel. Although it was not statistically significant, we see a tendency where the individuals on the higher end of the y-axis fixating on the IP boundary image earlier than the individuals on the lower end of the y-axis. And this trend is in line with the prediction. The prediction for pitch reset is that individuals who produce larger F0 differences across IP boundaries would be more sensitive to pitch reset than those who produce smaller F0 differences. It means that the presence as well as the absence of pitch reset would be information for the former group of listeners. So for them, the lack of pitch reset with the absence of other IP marking properties will facilitate their response. And the presence of pitch reset with the absence of other IP cues would slow down their response because there's conflicting information about the upcoming boundary. However, for those who are not sensitive to pitch reset, the presence and absence of pitch reset would not influence the timing of their response. So a leftward skew is predicted for the stimuli with no pitch reset on the left, and we would expect to see a rightward skew for the small and large reset conditions. But as you can see in these plots, there's no clear relation between the produced pitch reset and the timing of their responses. Lastly, for final lengthening, I did not use a continuous production value like pause duration and pitch reset. Instead, I simplified the 6 patterns of final lengthening into 2 groups, the early versus late onset of final lengthening. The prediction for final lengthening is that individuals who produce final lengthening early on, or who I call group 1, are more sensitive to lengthening than those who start the final lengthening later, or group 2. So group 1 will interpret the presence of final lengthening as conflicting information about the outcoming boundary when they hear final lengthening without the other IP marking cues. And therefore, they will fixate less on the word boundary than group 2, who are not as sensitive to the lengthening information as group 1. As you can see, group 1 and 2 are not significantly different from each other. There's a weak trend in the last condition where the group 1 fixated earlier than group 2, which is counter to the prediction. Summarizing the results of the individual analysis, the strongest support for a close relation between production and perception of project boundaries comes from the weak trends observed for pause duration, meaning individuals with longer pauses responded faster than those with shorter pauses. For pitch reset and final lengthening, there was no trend or significant differences that are consistent with the predictions. One of the contributions of this study is that the individual differences in both production and perception were examined in a systematic way, and the different patterns of producing and perceiving the IP marking properties were characterized. With regards to the weighting of the IP marking properties, pitch reset turned out to be less consistent than pause and final lengthening in both production and perception, which is in line with some of the previous studies that showed pause or final lengthening being more heavily weighted than the intonational marker for the IP boundary. As for the main hypothesis of the study, the results didn't find clear, significant evidence for a close relation between production and perception of project boundaries across different IP marking properties and across different conditions. Maybe it means that production is not reflected in perception, and limitations from the design of the study or the small number of participants, meaning less power, are also possible. And one reasonable account for the mixed findings on the production perception link, as discussed some of these in some of these studies, is that not everyone in the community must demonstrate close production perception link for a sound change to occur, but rather it is possible to have a sound change motivated by some people who do manifest such a relation. And I'm happy to talk more about this particular participant as an example if anyone would like to. But for now, thank you for listening to my talk.
Thank you.
Should I stop my slides? Stop sharing my slides?
It's up to you, but you can keep your slides just in case if people ask questions on the slides. Now, yeah, if you have a question, please send me a chat message. While waiting, I have a question actually. So you look at the pitch reset with the F0 maxima at the IP boundary that you wanted to investigate, and then the result, if I understood correctly, the result was rather weaker than what you expected, right?
Yes.
And I was wondering, since I was wondering whether there's any other type of pitch that could have aided them to produce the IP boundary or listen to the IP boundary rather than the pitch reset. For example, the pitch excursion that leading toward an IP boundary or the beginning of an IP after an IP boundary, like if they, not the pitch reset, but other things like, because recently I was listening to some Korean and I was wondering like some kind of boundaries were really marked by this, not just the lengthening, but rather the pitch excursion at the final area, final word or like final syllable. And do you have any thoughts about that other acoustic parameter that might be contributing to understanding this pattern better? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, you're right. So the three main properties for characterizing IP boundaries is pause, final lengthening, and boundary tone. A lot of people have studied the intonational pattern, the pitch excursion, not just pitch reset. And I decided to use pitch reset to sort of indirectly capture the pitch difference across the boundary, and also to have the three different acoustic cues become available at different time points, the final lengthening and pause and pitch reset. But certainly it is, it'll be more, I think, more detailed look if I included the actual pitch excursion before the pause becomes available, and perhaps more robust variations if pitch excursion was included in the design. It's very hard to quantify and also give the different level of excursion for individuals who have different F0 range.
Yeah, thank you. Next, we have some questions. Christine Yu from UMass Amherst. You can unmute your microphone and ask question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
Hi.
thanks so much. It's so great to see this careful, study between individuals looking at perception and production. One question I had, it's a little bit of a follow-up on the previous question is, yeah, I was curious a little bit more about what was going on across the sentence in terms of, let's say, like the kinds of pitch accents or the properties of pitch accents and other things, or also boundaries. Let's say even before getting up right to your target region, since there have been studies where it looks like people find long range like correlations between kinds of prosodic events that go on earlier and later. And I know that you had this kind of focus kind of environment, so you might have had some deaccenting, but yeah, there could have been pitch accents and boundaries as well. So I was curious what you might have noticed about these.
Right. So as you noticed, I only presented, I only tested stimuli using the deaccented target word sequences. So there's a word item early in the sentence and later after the target word sequence that's focused, so that participants will hear the focused item, and then going into the rest of the first sentence, they will not hear pitch accent. But they were exposed to different versions of the sentence with the focused, with the target word getting the pitch accent in the production study. And they are the same participants in the production and perception studies. So I do have some hard to explain results with regards to pitch resets, because I have some significant differences, systemic differences earlier before the critical pitch reset differences become available. So maybe it is, it's my speculation that some participants in the raw data, looking at the raw data, some participants did have looks to either IP or word boundary images before they reached the pitch reset information. So maybe pitch accent, remembering that the target word sequence had pitch accent in the production study may have something to do with that results. Thank you for the question.
Yes, thank you. Next question is from Kanan Bryce, UCLA. You can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. I have a general question. So do you think that you're finding that there's this correlation between individuals between their pause durations and the lack of that finding with regard to the other correlates of boundary? Do you think this means that the kind of cognitive factors underlying duration of pause in production and perception kind of fundamentally differ from those influencing the other factors? Or do you think it's more of kind of a difference along a scale rather than difference in kind?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I did think about a little bit about that because they are fundamentally different cues. It's intonational. Pitch accent, pitch reset is intonational, involves F0 differences, and individuals have inherently different F0 levels and ranges to begin with, and their perception to durational cues like pause duration and final lengthening, they could be different. And I am blanking on the actual papers, but I am aware there are studies available that investigate the difference in those sort of differences between those cues sort of in an inherent level, and I do think the magnitude of these two very different cues also would have had something to do with the results, that the pause duration was such a robust cue because it, not just because it is continuous, the different durations of pause, but I manipulated absence and presence of pause, and it is much more robust than the continuous final lengthening and F0, and also the degree, the magnitude of pitch reset I used in the auditory simile was perhaps not very salient for some of the participants who had greater pitch reset in their repertoire. It is true that they must have experience with smaller pitch resets. It is I think good question for follow-up analysis or study.
Cool, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and Shigeto Kawahara from Keio can ask the question. You can unmute yourself.
Well, one is just a comment. So we knew for a long time that a particular contrast is conveyed in multiple phonetic dimensions, right? Like voicing, you have closure voicing, low F1, low F0, and other things. And people like John Kingston have proposed that, well, you know, we observe these multiple dimensionality, but that's perceptually integrated, so it's really one cue. But I guess what you're suggesting is that it's unlikely, because it's unlikely that pitch reset and pause duration have been integrated into one cue, right? So it seems like your results seem to be suggesting that we really have to take this individual variations at the face value. That's just a comment, not a question. My question, I guess, is related to what Kanan asked, I think. On what theoretical grounds do we expect the correlation between the production and the perception? Which is to say that, you know, we seem to know that speakers use different cues to signal the same thing, why would you expect other people to speak like us? That seems like the underlying assumption of your research question. But is there any like a theory of speech production or perception that would make us think that way?
So I think I only talked about the assumption regarding initiation of sound change, that you have to assume that some participants, some people in the community, in the speech community, at least some of them, they sort of reproduce their own perceptual biases in their production to be able to start sound change by misperception. But it is also assumptions, underlying assumption in some theories of exemplar theories that assumes a loop between production and perception. That is, as I'm aware.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jiseung. This concludes the first part of today's session. We will now create a breakout room, and please join the breakout room if you want to continue the discussion. The next talk will begin at 11 a.m. Thank you.